Mrs. Eddy Purloins From Hegel by Walter M. Haushalter. Chapter 1. Mrs. Eddy and the Ghost of Hegel. If any so-called new school claims to be Christian Science and yet uses another author's discoveries without giving that author proper credit, such a school is erroneous, for it inculcates a breach of that divine commandment in the Hebrew Decalogue, "Thou shalt not steal." Mrs. Eddy, Science and Health, page 112. No human pen nor tongue taught me the science contained in this book, Science and Health. I have found nothing in ancient or in modern systems on which to found my own, except the teachings and demonstrations of our great Master and the lives of prophets and apostles. The Bible has been my only authority. I have had no other guide in the straight and narrow way of truth. Science and Health, pages 110 and 126. Mark Twain prophesies. In 1907, with Mrs. Eddy still in the land of the living to controvert him, Mark Twain none too humorously challenged her authorship of Science and Health. He writes, "The immense contrast between the legitimate English of Science and Health and the bastard English of Mrs. Eddy's miscellaneous work, and between the maturity of the one diction and the juvenility of the other, compels the question, are there two guns? It would seem so. Is there a poor, foolish old scattering flintlock for rabbit, and a long-range, center-driving, up-to-date Mauser magazine for elephant? It looks like it." Christian Science, page 117. Mark Twain confessed he had never had access to the scarce first edition of Science and Health, which, because of its juvenile grammar, laughable punctuation, sentences that had no beginning, end, or middle, and its quaint irrationalities, Mrs. Eddy wisely forbade her followers later to read. This edition has since been reprinted and may now be easily consulted. Had he read that 1875 product, his shafts of ridicule had been the more sharply barbed. But the later editions, out of which Mrs. Eddy's literary advisor, Reverend James Henry Wigan, in 1885, took the corduroy, if not the fantastic absurdities, were quite enough to make Mark Twain's cup of sardonic wrath overflow. He writes, "If the late Josh Billings should rise up and tell me that he wrote Herbert Spencer's philosophies, I should answer and say that the spelling casts a doubt upon his claim. If the late Jonathan Edwards should rise up and tell me he wrote Mr. Dooley's books, I should answer and say that the marked difference between his style and Dooley's is argument against the soundness of his statement." Christian Science, page 129. It is within the bounds of plausibility that Mrs. Eddy welcomed the accusation that Quimby originated Christian Science on the same assumption that a fox welcomes the sound of dogs on the wrong scent. That Mrs. Eddy derived from P. Quimby the idea of healing by mental means, her many letters to him, and statements made in her own handwriting prior to 1873 clearly indicate. But about 1873, she began to disavow indebtedness to Quimby, who died February 6, 1866, and to proclaim that she had suddenly discovered Christian Science by divine revelation. Twain seems never to have shared the Quimby tradition which so obsesses Dresser. In his book published in 1921, The Quimby Manuscripts, showing the discovery of spiritual healing and the origin of Christian Science, edited by Horatio W. Dresser. As to prevent consideration of other possible sources of appropriations, Dresser also wrote a book on the logic of Hegel. The great American humorist had no time to investigate the possible areas from which it did come. His surmise, however, was in the direction of some unknown author who died before his work gained the light of public attention. Clemens' conjecture, in part, now comes true. The prophecies and guesses of Woodbridge Riley and the many other critics concerning the unknown author, constituting one of the mysterious enigmas of modern literature, at last come to fulfillment. Mrs. Eddy's literary dualism. The literary products carrying Mrs. Eddy's name present a dualism of lofty idealism and sentimental materialism. Herein lies the fascination of her book for untutored minds and the irritation of it for orderly thinkers. That Mrs. Eddy had her own say is evidenced by the following. It is related that a father plunged his infant babe, only a few hours old, into the water for several minutes, and repeated this operation daily until the child could remain under water 20 minutes, moving and playing without harm, like a fish. Parents should remember this and learn how to develop their children properly on dry land. Science and Health, page 556. That some mysterious and powerful intellect appears on the scene at broken intervals is sensed in such passages as the following. The Ptolemaic blunder could not affect the harmony of being, as does the error relating to soul and body, which reverses the order of science and assigns to matter the power and prerogative of spirit, so that man becomes the most absolutely weak and inharmonious creature in the universe. Science and Health, page 123. See page 35. The above quotations are as plainly the emanation of two widely different minds as are the writings of Bill Nye and St. Francis. Often, after stumbling through a foggy swamp of subjectivism, one emerges upon a page or half-page of terse, clear, brilliant metaphysics worthy of a Kant or a Royce. It is this dualism of crude mythology and valid science, of wild chaos and stately order, of nonsense and sense, that exasperates. Here, in truth, is an enigma. Only one key can unlock this anomaly. Mrs. Eddy, in the lucid spots, must be the voice for some powerful philosophic unknown. This which floated as a suspicion with many critical minds and found voice of accusation with Mark Twain and Woodbridge Riley comes now to an authentic head. That Mrs. Eddy became a mediumistic mouthpiece for a varied group of philosophic ghosts, plagiarizing pretty phrases, clauses, and sentences from Carlyle, Amiel, Ruskin, and others is now well known. In the concluding section of this book will be found many examples of literary peculations by Mrs. Eddy, all of which are or can be accurately dated, covering the period from 1895 to 1907. No one reading the astounding array could believe, even were there no evidence to the contrary, that such literary theft was confined solely to this particular period of her literary career, but that the same flagrant adoption of the words and thoughts of others must have colored her production from her very beginning as a Christian Scientist. They are included merely to show that this hard-to-be-accounted-for pilfering was a chronic condition. It must remain for another to diagnose the cause. In Mrs. Eddy's Message to the Mother Church, 1900, she lays bare her mind on the subject of literary piracy in saying, "A wicked man has little real intelligence. He may steal other people's good thoughts and wear the purloined garment as his own, till God's discipline takes it off for his poverty to appear." In another communication, she reverses her pronouncement by straightway pirating a full page of 200 words from a sermon by an English clergyman, Dr. Hugh Blair, and with an altered word here and there makes it the substance of her message to the first members. A tinge of irony is added in that the sermon of Hugh Blair from which Mrs. Eddy plagiarized her message bore the title, The Man of Integrity, quoted in full, page 113. Edwin Frandon Dakin, in commenting on the minor plagiarisms of Mrs. Eddy, included in his book, Mrs. Eddy, The Biography of a Virginal Mind by Edwin Frandon Dakin, expressed the opinion that the source from which the major transfer was made might never be disclosed because the man of literary and philosophic abilities equal to the task would never devote the time the search would require. It might well demand endless quest through obscure and forgotten mazes of universal literature. Precisely this task, however, was undertaken. But the detective work on examination was not as formidable as it might seem on first blush. Certain converging lines narrowed the area of search. Somewhere, in the literature of idealism, the coveted object must lie hidden if it had not been destroyed by time's remorseless maw, or by deliberate intent. But the literature of idealism is a vast expanse in itself. It had flourished in Plato's day. It pursued its course in Alexandria, Rome, Florence, Berlin, Oxford, Boston. It produced its Clements, Ciceros, Lorenzos, Kants, Fichte's, Schiller's, Coleridge's, Emerson's, and around these greater lights, endless satellites whirled, reflecting and creating, in their individual ways, their own idealistic lights and colors. Gradually, however, this broad field narrowed appreciably. Mrs. Eddy used such words as apodictical, a term coined by Kant. Her doctrines of identity and reflection were strongly like those of Schelling, Fichte, Herbart, and other expounders of German transcendentalism. Her expression, science of being, is found intact in both Fichte and Coleridge. Her doctrines of the negation of evil, the nothingness of matter, the eternity of ideas, the deathlessness of man, narrowed the scope yet further. Particularly her consent to the mythical theory of Jesus and her placing of Christianity in the metaphysical Christos doctrine drew the line definitely toward the movement of Strauss and the right wing of Hegelianism. The body of her writings seemed, in final analysis, a distortion with the peculiar aberrations of Mrs. Eddy added, of Kantian, Fichtean, or Hegelian transcendentalism. All the vast literature of that movement was the haystack to be sifted, and here the needle might be found, and if not, well, a pleasant holiday in the most stimulating literature the Western world has produced would offer compensations. The research was conducted in leading American libraries from the Atlantic to the Pacific. No ancient or modern idealistic writings antedating 1870 were neglected. Jakob Böhmer's Expositions of Moses, London, 1654, Astray's Emblems, 1760, Malebranche's Dialogues, London, 1699, and 1,000 similar leads were consulted in the treasure rooms of great libraries. Now it would be William Adams' Elements of Christian Science, Wisconsin, 1850, to be ransacked, or Swedenborg, or Sir Edwin Arnold's translation of the Bhagavad Gita. Again, such works as Ackermann's Das Christliche im Plato, Hamburg, 1835, would call attention. Dusty volumes on animal magnetism, influence of religion on health, mesmerism, Kabbalism were scanned exhaustively. When the libraries of America failed to produce suspected works such as Jane Lead's Fountain of Gardens or Eternal Invisibles, photostats were secured from the British Museum. So it continued from Aristotle's Metaphysics to Brownson's New Views, the list expanding to many thousands of tomes. Not a few minor wellsprings were uncovered from which Mrs. Eddy had sipped. Her phrase, Father, Mother, God, and her addiction to the ancient Babylonian creed of the male-female principle of creation had sifted down through the banner of light, a spiritualistic paper. Her fantastic use of the Adam myth and her glossary, see page 123, of weird terms, many of which never appear in the body of her book, must have been derived from the literature of Kabbalism, such as Swedenborg. The Kabbalists conceived the scriptures to be written in cipher or code, its lock requiring a key. Much of her scholarly flourish in dealing with Genesis is traceable to the famous Jean Astruc. Astruc was the first theologian in modern times to discern the dual strain of Babylonian and Jewish elements in the book of Genesis. His ideas were disseminated through liberal theologians in New England, and Mrs. Eddy may have here got her idea of a key to the scriptures to be added to science and health. But Mark Twain's big gun remained yet to be uncovered. A casual reference. The turning point in the search came one day with a casual and then a startled reading of Sybil Wilbur's account of Hiram S. Craft's in her book, The Life of Mary Baker Eddy, authorized and published by the Mother Church, pages 154 to 165. She tells of Mrs. Eddy's meeting Crafts in a Lynn boarding house in 1866, and her later sojourn of a year and a half in the Crafts' home at East Stoughton, now Avon, Massachusetts. Crafts, who later opened a healing office with Mrs. Eddy in Taunton, is described as a Kantian transcendentalist, a Yankee workman transcendentalized. Sybil Wilbur devotes several paragraphs to exposition of Kantianism with which, through Hicks, Ballou, and Emerson, and others, New England had been saturated, and concludes by saying, "Thus it was not left for the Yankee shoe worker to dig it out of the critique." Here was offered an amazing lead. The better part of Science and Health was outright Kantian transcendentalism, and now comes a man, Hiram S. Crafts, in whose home Mrs. Eddy lived for a year and a half, who was a Kantian transcendentalist. This incident might easily be more than accident or coincidence. Might it not have causal relation? If Hiram Craft's library, to which Mrs. Eddy would have had access from 1866 to 1868, could be consulted, it might narrow the search to a conclusion. Sybil Wilbur states in her narrative of the Crafts episode that it was in the Crafts home in Avon that Mrs. Eddy began to systematize her ideas and to write out a new manuscript. The conviction pressed to the fore that Hiram S. Crafts once possessed works on Kantian transcendentalism, from which Mrs. Eddy might have acquired extensive materials. The problem became then to search out Craft's remaining descendants and acquaintances, then to find and to consult those books. The search was forthwith shifted to the Stoughton-Avon area, 15 or 20 miles south of Boston, the habitat of Mrs. Eddy during the formative 2 years, the years that produced the book, as sympathetic biographer Powell terms them. In Stoughton, fully a score of acquaintances of both Crafts and Mrs. Eddy were found, many with spicy remembrances of a half-century ago. In Edgar Allan Poe's tale of the Purloined Letter, the searchers ransacked obscure drawers and tapped walls to discover the hiding place of the stolen object. All the time, the coveted document lay plain to view and escaped detection because it was so obvious. By way of parallel, the long-suspected, long-sought source from which Mary Baker Eddy plagiarized her final revelation reposed for 50 years at Avon, Massachusetts, within close touch of ardent searchers and easily available. S. Minute Crane of Avon. During research in Stoughton, someone recalled S. Minute Crane as one closely associated with Crafts, and suggested that he might be able to supply information regarding books Crafts may have had and their disposal after his decease. Mr. Crane was sought out, but at first meeting he was reluctant to say much. On better acquaintance, however, he warmed up and talked freely. Crane had been an apprentice and confidant of Hiram S. Crafts during the days of Mrs. Eddy's residence in the Crafts home in Avon. He was born in 1846 and for nearly 90 years lived in the house in which he was born, opposite the Crafts home on Pond Street. Both houses still stand. Crane, as assistant to Crafts, was in and out of the Crafts home frequently. Throughout his life, he was a respected citizen of Avon and for 30 years an elder in the Baptist Church, and was regarded by his friends as one of Avon's leading citizens. After several talks, Crane one day brought out a carefully wrapped paper parcel. When the wrapper was removed, there was revealed a letter written to Hiram Crafts, some personal papers, a printed announcement of a new book by Andrew Jackson Davis, see page 123, then enjoying wide publicity and discussion, and a beautifully written age document of 12 pages entitled The Metaphysical Religion of Hegel. One glimpse of its contents was sufficient to realize that the long-sought quarry had been unearthed. Mr. Crane stated that in the early 80s, the letter and manuscript were placed in his hands by Crafts, the occasion being Crafts' departure from Avon and Stoughton. Crafts divulged to him the significance of the document, its intimate relation to Mrs. Eddy's book, and expressed the hope that someday the facts would be made public. S. Minute Crane, possessor of the document and the letter from Dr. Lieber to Hiram Crafts, had for 50 years felt that he had been handed a thankless mission and a vicarious burden, which he proposed to unload upon posterity, stating that he meant to make a provision in his will that would ensure the document being made public after his death. Most of the biographers of Mrs. Eddy describe Crafts as a careless dandy, capable of making a nondescript and irresponsible solution of a complication. One last mysterious touch is lent to Crafts by a statement in the Millmine book, The Life of Mary Baker Eddy and the History of Christian Science by Georgine Millmine, to the effect that a few years before Mrs. Eddy's death, she sent for Mr. Crafts and paid his expenses to Pleasantview to deliver into her hands his copy of the manuscript, which she had used in teaching him, probably a copy of the Quimby manuscript, which he did. Mr. Crane finally consented to sell the document and letter on the understanding that they were not to be suppressed. A bill of sale was drawn up, and the desire of both Crafts and Crane drew nearer realization. An affidavit secured from Crane's family describes much of the history of the document, its transmittal and descent, and Mrs. Eddy's access to it. Crafts first met Mrs. Eddy in Lynn, where he was temporarily employed in a shoe factory, soon after April 1st, the date the Lieber document came into his hands. Knowing how metaphysical healing was emphasized in it, Crafts must have listened with astonishment and satisfaction when Mrs. Eddy discoursed on Quimby's method of healing by mental means. This she was doing at that time and continued to do until some 8 years later when she began to disavow him. One can picture the enthusiasm that must have possessed Crafts when he suggested that Mrs. Eddy come to Stoughton and join the Crafts household. The occasion must have been an exciting one in the experience of both. Crafts returned to Stoughton on November 22nd, 1866. The idea of opening an office with Mrs. Eddy for the practice of healing by the mental means that he had learned from the Liber document and that she had learned from Quimby, quickly followed, and all then moved to Taunton, where the experiment was made. It was short-lived. Dissension arose. She left the Crafts house in August, and Crafts resumed shoemaking.